From religion to wrestling, gumbo to grits, politics to poetry, and all things Southern in between, this is Take on the South. Produced by the Institute for Southern Studies and hosted by the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina, Take on the South examines the highs and lows of the American South, examines the truths and fictions of the country's most distinctive region, and picks the brains of some of its most accomplished students. To understand the South, you need to take it on, and that's what we'll be doing. Join us as we take on the South.
Hi, listeners. Welcome to Take on the South, the podcast of the University of South Carolina's Institute for Southern Studies. I'm one of the hosts, Emily Allen, and I'm excited to share with you one of my conversations about music history and culture of the South. Our guest for this episode is Marvin McNeil, a PhD candidate in ethnomusicology at Wesleyan University. He is assistant professor of music and African American studies at the Oxford College of Emory University. So thanks for joining us today, Marvin.
Well, thank you for having me, Emily. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Yeah, I'm excited for our chat. And before we get into the nitty-gritty of your work, can you tell us about yourself, how you got into this project? What's your backstory?
Yes, all right. Well, I'm going to really contextualize my research by saying that I've always been a band person. I was born into the band world. My dad was an Army bandsman. And so my research now comes full circle, as I'll expand upon, later in this interview. But that is the background in the current basis of my research. I was at the University of Connecticut for 16 years as the associate director of the marching band and pep band. I did the concert band, and it was actually during a trip, and I know you're down there in Gamecock land, but one of my duties as the associate band directors was to take the pep bands to the tournaments, postseason basketball tournaments. And on 2004, I remember it because it was the first time that both of our teams were in the Final Four, and they ended up winning, both. But I was with the women's team, and they happened to be in New Orleans. And so during that trip to New Orleans, it was my very first time seeing a brass band on the street. And more importantly, a brass band that was made up of Black youth. And so we arrived like a day before. So you have some free time to walk around and check things out. But across the street, it was on the corner of Bourbon and Canal Street. And I could hear it as I was walking closer. I mean, it certainly was a soundscape that was happening, and it sounded like they had an amplification, but there was no amplification. They were just up against the, at that time, it was a Foot Locker mural there. And so they were up against the Foot Locker mural. And so, I brought the pep band down, but we had rehearsed the pep band. It's the Final Four, and we want to sound nice and strong, and we wanted to woo the crowd. But meantime, I hear this brass band on the street. I'm like, oh boy, because they were really good, and the crowd loved them, And so I stood there for about 3 hours, to be honest, just watching this band. And there are a few things that really caught my eye, and I continued to ask questions and think about that moment. And that was actually my entryway into ethnomusicology, which I'll bridge, as we move in later. But those questions, first of all, they're all Black youth, playing the repertoire, span the traditional repertoire, traditional literature of the New Orleans tradition. And then it also had, contemporary hip hop songs and things in between, some Motown tunes, and they were strong. So, I said, well, do they rehearse themselves? Or is it part of a school? And then, they had a box out there and they're making money. So they're entrepreneurs through there. And I hadn't seen this anywhere else. I've seen, street acts with mainly bucket drums, that sort of thing. And then, of course, New York City, you have the break dancers. And, I was in Connecticut and jazz, players. But this was the first time that I was blown away from this in many respects. And so that band happened to be the To Be Continued brass band, which we'll talk about later. That's one of my, collaborators in my research, just the To Be Continued brass band. And so after that experience, we went back after the tournament and it just stuck with me. So I began to find all the brass band music that I could find. I was familiar with, Rebirth Brass Band and the Dirty Dozen Brass Band, of course, but it was all recording. I hadn't really, experienced it in person. And so I learned, I got all the Rebirth albums and played along. And then some other recordings had come up. I think the Hot Eight and some of the other groups. And I started just learning every parts. Then I began to think about, can this happen in any other city? We have a lot of organized bands that are, happening with schools, high schools, and then churches as well. Of course, the military bands that are happening. But as far as youth performing and making money, can that happen anywhere else? Probably in New York City, touristy places, but you didn't have that, tradition. And so I began to dig into the historical context of music in New Orleans, and really getting back into Congo Square and connecting, that whole history and timeline up until this point. And so my next step was, I'm gonna try to form a band with the repertoire. And so I picked probably about 5 tunes, and this was it had to be 8 years later. I mean, it's very patient, slow moving. But I had the right people in the marching band. You had some guys who could solo and had some type of personality that can help pull this off. And so I sent them an email. They were already busy, marching band. Some of them are music majors in their ensembles, pep band. And so, yeah, I sent them email, see if they want to add something else to their schedule. And so I sent them some recordings, and so they said, yeah, Marv, we'll try anything once. They're being nice, that sort of thing. And so they learned the tune, and it was actually it was a Stooges tune. Where are you from? The Stooges, yeah. And so we learned that. They learned it by ear, and we got together, and they liked it. So every Friday we started to meet, and we built this repertoire, and then we began to play around campus. Of course, it was more mobile than a big marching band. It was more interesting than pep band, as we could play, the pop tune, something a little bit different. And so we became wanted on campus, even for the dean stuff. And then that kind of migrated off campus. We began to play for fundraisers and then, other venues. And then the members of the band really started to take it seriously. And so, I was the associate director, so I was still working, all day long and then doing this. And they began to get gigs. And so I said, well, I started this, I'm going to stick with them. So I stuck with them. And we would play, we'd have 2-3 gigs a week. And then once the money started rolling in, then they really became interested, started to make this money. But in the meantime, they were called the Funky Dogs Brass Band. And in the meantime, we began to learn more of the culture and the history. And one of our members, he was the saxophone player, and he had an interest in the culture as well. And so he he came to me, wanted to write a grant. And the grant was to take the brass band on a statewide tour to the urban areas, places where, the music programs were really struggling. And so we applied for this grant, and we won the grant, and we began to tour around the Connecticut, Bridgeport area, out on the coast, Hartford, places that were struggling. And from that, word of mouth, more schools began to ask for us to come out, and we would do these presentations, concerts for the school, but also talk about the historical, cultural perspectives as well. And so as I began to do more of that type of presentation, I decided that at that time, I was a band director. So I went through a music education degree, master's in trombone performance. I really didn't know much about ethnomusicology. So I began to read more and more the current literature, I Googled brass bands. And of course, at that time, Matt Sakakini, his work was at the top of the list. So I read, a lot of his work. Of course, I wasn't in the ethnomusicology uh, um, program yet. So some of the jargon in the articles, it took me a while to figure out what was going on. I know now, but I actually reached out to Matt Sakakini and asked him a few questions, and he invited me down. And so I went down to meet him and talk a lot about what he did. And I'm like, wow, you can do this? Is this? And so that led me to at the crossroads of my career. I was pretty much the heir apparent to be the director of the marching band, but I, invested a lot into the program, and I didn't think I would want to continue a long time after the director moved on. I mean, we had a phenomenal relationship, and of course, he didn't want me to go. But I thought if I did make the move, then it would be too late, and I didn't want to regret it. So I started looking at other programs. I actually looked at Matt's program to get a master's, but then my backyard in Connecticut, we have Wesleyan University. And so with a wife and daughter, I decided to kind of look at locally. As, you're not as free moving around. And I met Eric Cherry and, explained to him, what I was looking at and where I was in my career. And he shared with me what they could offer there. And of course, the assistantship that they had, was very, very enticing. And so I went back and thought some more. And then I said, okay, here we go. I'm going to do this. So I went to, I finished up at UConn, and then I went over to Wesleyan as a full-time student. I needed to get a master's in ethno because I didn't have an MA, I had an MM. And so we had the joint program, the MA PhD program, which I'm currently, finishing up my dissertation and hope to defend in the next month or so. But, with that, had the opportunity to go do field work, and actually engage in the New Orleans culture. And the band was the TBC brass band. And so that'll make a lot more sense as we move along. And so as I continued the program, at Wesleyan, my research began to expand a little bit. Once I get a full understanding and spectrum of, ethnomusicology and, finding, a music tradition, but within that music tradition, finding, some theoretical frameworks to engage in. One of my professors, she's actually on my committee, Sue Jang, and she suggested, I was working on a class project, and I was sharing some of my fieldwork recordings with her. And within that fieldwork recording, I was part of my deep hanging out, and part of that was down there in Jackson Square with the All Stars. One of the trumpet player that plays with TBC also played with the All Stars. But in between, while they're hanging out there ready to play, we just hung and just chatted and talked. But one thing that was a big, it was, I would say, a red light, but something that I hadn't really considered, because even my identity is African American, I still had a different experience than, those musicians. And so when they getting to know me and, my background, they had an interest in a lot of questions of, how I got to where I was. And, of course, I was more interested in their musicality and how they learned all that music and that sort of thing. But within the discussions, I soon realized that those brass band musicians, if they didn't have instruments in their hands, they're treated like any other Black youth in the city. And that was one of the glaring points in the interview when he was talking about that, and how one time they had gone out of the city you know how sometimes they'll have these festivals and they'll bring like a few groups from New Orleans. And so they were part of that. And they, when they had their instruments and they were playing, you know, they were, oh, you know, heroes. But when they didn't have their instruments, you know, it was almost like double magnet, stay away. They were, you know, they're fearful. So Sue Jane, you know, started suggesting that I look at the concept at African American youth, and more importantly, African American male youth. You know, the reason being, you know, of course, you know, as we're really kind of sifting out the, you know, gendering of instruments, and especially in the band, gendering of, you know, within the band. But she pointed out that, you know, much work was being done, you know, from that area, and that, you know, sometimes this story may be not told. I mean, you know, their story, you know, won't get out there in lieu of the other theoretical frameworks that are very important as well. So I decided, yes, that's the route I will go. For another reason too, is that, you know, I think, you know, as, you know, with my identity as being a male, African American male, if I were, you know, Kyle DeCoste did it with the Pinettes, but still, you know, it's a different interaction between, you know, people that are almost around your age. And, you know, so I said, I'm more comfortable with this. But then as I moved on, I found it to be very, very important, as their story is very important to hear. And I think throughout time, you know, even now, their story is not told. We see, you know, these remnants, you know, that are continued to be perpetuated of identities that are put out there, but we very rarely hear, you know, from the actual voices. And so that's why I decided to go with male. And then the youth culture, that's important as well. I think you know, as we study the history, the New Orleans brass band history in itself, you know, as you know, Emily, because you've done this research and study, is that, you know, in the late, you know, 50s and 60s, this thing almost died out because of the age, you know, of the musicians. And then, you know, Danny Barker came back. It was a renaissance, but he really focused on the youth. And I think that point is very, it's monumental, you know, obviously in the brass band culture, but I think it's monumental in youth organization culture, and something that is still a common thread to the groups to this day. And I find that within TBC, you know, that's what I could see that important thread in that music. And I think before I continue on, I'll let you kind of, you know, maybe redirect me, or because I know you want to get into some specifics of my research, but I hope that long-winded answer shows you how I got to where I am in my research.
No, that was great. You definitely like set a wonderful foundation for so many like great questions that I have in mind now. I'll actually probably pick up what you were laying down at the end of that question there, which is that idea of youth. So you've been talking a lot about part of your work, which is like you were talking about in the brass band context from New Orleans. I think there's also an interesting aspect too of your positionality that you were talking about as well towards the beginning of you've worked with youth as well in like a collegiate setting. So I think you have a very important perspective, having worked with like different generations of brass, wind, percussion musicians, both now getting to know the New Orleans context, but also again as an insider on the higher ed context. So with this kind of like bird's eye view that you have of the construction of youth, how do you see your work expanding that idea of youth? And what I mean by that is how you're kind of considering it right to continue into like mid-20s, like versus like the traditional age of like 19, for instance. Can you tell us how and why you're expanding this idea of youth? You're already kind of getting at that, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yes, and I consider in my research, I'm looking at specifically the ages of 15 and 25. And there's the data actually brought me to this place. And one striking, data point is that if we can get African American youth to at least 30 years old without being incarcerated or killed, the chances of them living, into their 50s or 60s are greater. And so once I looked at that, then I began to think about my field work. And not only my field work is my personal story. As I mentioned, my dad, and my dad's story overlaps with Melvin Miles, who was the director for 50 years at Morgan State University. And so that was my second field site for HBCU. And so both of their stories overlap as they grew up both in Baltimore. My dad was on the east side and he was on the west side. They didn't know each other personally at the time, but they had a lot of common friends, within that, because they were both musicians. Both of their stories, which Melvin Miles, I really bring out in my dissertation in one of the chapters. It follows his growth in the community and in music, and it was always embedded within the community. One of his friends that lived behind him played trumpet before he even started an instrument, and so that inspired him to play an instrument. He talks about his teachers at every step, all the way up through college, the community bands he played in, so forth and so on. And so he was on the west side, and my dad was on the east side. And my dad was actually, I'm going to back up to Mr. Miles. Mr. Miles, he had a traditional family. His mom and dad were in the house and that sort of thing. And he grew up in the west side of Baltimore, had a lot of very prominent African Americans that grew up in that area that time. And the east side of Baltimore, my dad was actually, him and his sister were abandoned by their parents. And so they were dropped off at their great aunts. And so you're in Baltimore, in the urban area. And so there are a lot of things that you can get into that will get you off the right track. And so music saved my dad. It was specifically a music teacher. He taught trumpet out of his basement. He was right across the street. And both Mr. Miles and my dad talked about this person, as being very prominent in the city. And so my dad started playing and loved it and was talented and, was in the all-city band. He was actually in the Colt marching band, the Baltimore Colts when they were in Baltimore. He was actually in the Colt marching band, and then he got two scholarships to Norfolk State University. And that was in the late 60s. And one scholarship was for ROTC and one was for music. And at that point, they had ROTC band, which a lot of the HBCUs had a military band. And then they also had the civilian band. And he actually did both. He was a tuba player. But before he could finish his school, before he could graduate, the draft, he was very high on the draft because he was in the ROTC for the Vietnam War. So he decided to go ahead and join the band so he can pick where he wanted to be. So he joined the Army band at that point, in which the military, is very big in the history of African American band. And so, when I look at my research, I look at it through the lens of the African American band tradition. And, I think kind of reframing it, as one of those areas where you had opportunity and to cultivate, your talent, obviously African Americans, Black people, they were part of the military, even beginning the Revolutionary War, but they weren't allowed to carry guns, right? They either could do, domestic stuff, cooking, but they also, had the band tradition, which that's a common thread, from, Frank Johnson. I mean, he took that band over, overseas very early in the game. First band, I think, was overseas. I don't think they were military, but then James Reed Short came along And then even, besides that, they had people like Clark Terry, where they recruited an entire HBCU band to be the first Navy band. I'm like, wow. And so that's part of that tradition. And so my dad's story, Mr. Miles' story, putting it, connecting it to the TBC brass band as well, which they started in high school. The band director at their high school interviewed him, and he talked about the band was going on a trip, preparing to go on a trip to Georgia, up here to Georgia, and each student in the band needed to raise a certain amount of money. I think it was like $250 or $300, something like that. And they didn't have it. And so the band director was in the French quarters one Tuesday night. It was during the week, and something caught his eye, and he saw these group of band members down there in the French Quarter, and he said it was late. He said they had no business being out that late. I mean, it's New Orleans, but he went over to see what they were doing. They were all huddled up. Once they, kind of opened up, they had some drugs they were going to sell to raise money for the trip. They got it from their uncle or something. And he said, yeah, let me get this. He took it away before the authorities could see it. And he said, come back and see me tomorrow at school. So he put together a bunch of tunes for them to learn, to go out and play to earn money. And so they learned these tunes. They went out to, first of all, the Jazz Fest. They went out, outside of the festival and raised all of the money they needed within a couple hours. That sparked their drive. And so they ended up moving down to the Bourbon and Canal. And so that was TBC. And so they were there all the way up until Katrina hit. They started maybe 2002. And so they performed there up till Katrina, and then after Katrina, 10 years or so after, until the noise ordinance came in. But that's another story for a different day. But they're still together. But during that, they're still together, which I just kind of said it flippantly, but them still being together over 20 years, it even it validated my reframing, changing the lens about the importance of learning how to be in community through the band. And I think, a lot of that has to do, because of their things that happen while you play music together, that they understand this, this back and forth, this exchange. And then, of course, when someone's not there, they're missing, you need it, is valued. And, all these things that, students that get off on the wrong beaten path, those are the things that they say they're missing. Even, gang research. Yeah, gangs are a community as well, but they seek to fill those voids, but just in that other context, that sort of thing. One of my main collaborators down there with TBC is Edward Juicy Jackson III, trombone player. And, I've really become very, very close, with him. And a lot of it has to do with, I kind of help fill some of that he did not have as well, just by being there, by asking him questions. And as you know, they say field work changes your life. But, even to this day, he considers me family. I consider him family. As I began to dig more and more into the current stories, the current narrative, I began to trace the historical path to that point, and reframing and understanding, community. Of course, we understand that, African Americans, in order for this system to work, the transatlantic slave trade, they had to sever off the very thing that makes them a community. And some of the early research talked about the enslaved as they were being transported on the ships. Before they got off the ships, they were building kinships, because they stopped at different ports. So, they had to keep the, at that point, what they called their stock mixed up, to avoid any type of insurrection. but they, at that very point, they were building kinships, brother, sister, that sort of thing. And of course, that led me to kind of look at the indigenous cultures and how different groups of people thought about community, from the African continent. And so I looked at some African music scholars, and Ketia is one. Of course, he wrote a lot about, the importance of music and, the sustaining of community, and also, the life cycles and Zawi as well. But when I was at Wesleyan, one of my assignments I was a TA for the West African Drumming Ensemble. And so the Professor John Dankwa there, and Professor Edie Saka does the dance part. Professor John Dankwa does the drumming part. I would hang out a lot with them. And one thing that Edie Saka explained one time was how he was talking about the concept of filling in. We were doing this video for some school during COVID, and he was talking about the idea of filling in. And so at the end of the taping, I began to ask him about this filling in and music, and how these drums, you have like a small drum, middle drum, large drum. They're called different things in different African cultures. But he was explaining how each drum has a different part that fills into the whole. And so I'm like, wow, that's a way of teaching, students, youth, their part within a community, give and take, who's missing, who's not missing. And then the whole, becomes greater, because not in spite of the sum of the parts, but because of the sum of the parts sometimes, with that. And so I began to read more, and I look into Meki and Zawi, who kind of puts the drum ensemble, saying it's the mother, the mother kind of leads the whole thing, and then every down to the little child is part of it. It really came to roost when I was introduced to the Dagata people of the northern Ghana, and rituals. But he's almost like a shaman. He actually is part of the Dagata people, and also taught over here in the United States in Boston. And he was teaching a drum course, to West African drumming course here in the United States. And he could sense that Americans were searching for something. And his overall feeling and understanding was that they were missing community. And so, community can be ubiquitous. We use it. It has been theorized in many different configurations, but I'm looking at this within a community of survival, within the context of the African American experience. And so if this thing was severed at a certain point, and then also after the Atlantic slave trade was discontinued, domestic slave trade continued. And some of those forms were even worse, because you have the breeding. And so, you had this breakup of family in different contexts continuously. Then you move forward in history after the emancipation, after Reconstruction, there were, a few places in our nation where the African American community was beginning to thrive. And, that couldn't happen. So, they were rioted and burned and things like that. Then you look at, the voter suppression early on, where they would lynch people for trying to vote. And so I'm starting to look at, okay, what is community, and how do we learn how to be within community? And I read from a community scholar, Cohen, the first name escapes me, but Cohen essentially said that by looking at what community is not, kind of helps to explain what community is. And so I'm like, well, if you have all these contexts where you're not being brought into community, and you're taught, how does that affect, generations? Because this is it's hundreds of years this is going through, and so you're born in, into this, understanding and a way of being. And then also you move on to, post-industrialization. And then you also had the white flight, which, my dad and Mr. Miles talked a lot about. And of course, New Orleans, where you had, the everyone kind of getting out of the city, and not only the white flight, but the upper middle class African Americans, which set the example for everybody else. And so you extracted all of that away. And then that, in conjunction with Julius Wilson, idea that the lack of jobs creates this cycle of violence, because everything's extracted. And I could see that in real time during my field work, especially in New Orleans. And Juicy, who's the trombone player, would always say this, and I would never really take it serious. And he's like, it's Paleolithic down here. He's like, people will kill to live, to eat. People will shoot to eat. And I just kind of, let that go. But then it really hit me, that's a real thing. And a lot of that is because they do not have, those things embedded in what communities. Like, how does this one person, or these 9 people in TBC, 9 youth, their friends are the ones doing the other stuff in the city that we always see, but they're not in music. Not to say everyone in music doesn't make these mistakes, but the majority of them don't. Well, as we can see, the history of New Orleans music, many of them are embedded in the family tradition to begin with. You have these family names, that the Andrews, that are passed down. And so, it's there, and it's evident we can make those connections, with that. Looking at my dad, who didn't really have that, that extensive family, he got that through other ways. And so that's how my lens began to widen and say, well, what if I can expand this context? Because I've been in, more of a formalized setting of this. And just to let everyone know that I was associate director of predominantly white universities. So I didn't grow up, in an HBCU setting, although my mom and dad and my aunt, they were in HBCU settings. So when my background, 16 years of Division I football and basketball, when I went to do my field work at Morgan State University, it was clear and evident that it is unequal in every respect, as far as the infrastructure. And, but what wasn't unequal was the students. You could take those students that were in Morgan State and put them, in the UConn band room, and it was no different. They were youth, they were still figuring out the world, and they were still, they're a little bit older. And I think the coming of age as you get to 25 is even more important. And research shows that the brain is continuing to grow up until 25. And so say you barely make it, you're in the inner city, and then all of a sudden you have this very positive experience. You're on this trajectory, and you have these branches. You could either go one route or the other route. And so one route could be, I joined the band, or I love the drum line, and that could keep you alive. Or the other route is, I can make easy money by delivering this bag of whatever, that sort of thing. And so, in my interview with the TBC, the band director of TBC, he talked about that, them. And he even talked about how he would change his persona and dress to show that, going to school is more important, than the other stuff. So he would buy these knockdown big jerseys and that sort of thing. And the kids would ask him, where'd you get that? He's like, well, I went to college. He went to Southern. But, he kind of reframed it and recontextualized that. And so if we do not give up their grown-ups, at the age of 18 or 19, but extend that even more so in African Black youth, or even any youth, with some type of structure in place, I think it's very, very important. And there's great opportunity in that. Having been on a college campus for a long, long time, these students are still, no matter, where you're from, they're still growing in many different ways. And the idea of adulting is there where, a lot of these African American male youth are considered men before they even enter their teens. And they're viewed as men before they enter their teens, either, through various aspects of society, through the judicial system, that sort of thing. So hopefully this will help, change the narrative a bit, or maybe change the lens and seeing these as youth. Again, a long-winded answer, but I had to bring in, some context there.
No, absolutely. And there's another, you were talking about youth, and there you were talking a lot about as well the idea of community. And some of these, kind of shifting primarily for a second here on higher education, the marching band context. You have different generations of youth that begin to be impacted by that marching band experience. You've seen this firsthand. So I'm just curious if, like, in these different contexts, all these different higher education and marching band contexts you've been engaging with, what impact do you see on current marching band youth or alumni, who were youth, at that time? What kind of community building and what kind of impact are you seeing on these different generations through marching band participation?
Right. That's a great question. And I think I'll start with Morgan State, my time there. And, one of the biggest times on a HBCU campus is homecoming. And so I had the opportunity to see 2 homecomings there. And to talk about the intergenerational connection is very important with the alums. And then also you have the freshmen as well. And so I'll talk about the importance of the alumni first, and then work my way back down to the new members. And so not all marching band programs are like, I'm going to tell you that right now. And even especially, in the HBCU culture and the other culture as well, there's some things that some bands do that aren't quite, up to par. But I think it comes down to the director and Melvin Miles, based on my interview, extensive, almost 200 hours of recorded interview of, him talking about the culture of the band. And, he really made it a point to make it non-intimidating, non-hazing type of experience. And so looking at that lens, first of all, there were at least 10 to 15, maybe 20 alums that actually volunteer every week for the band. One was the announcer, had a few that would help move things. I interviewed them as well. This is out of their own precious time. And they said that, they have to give back because the band saved their lives, kept them, on a straight and narrow. And then you also have most of the staff. This teaching staff were actually former members of the band. They're passing it down, with pride. They're passing it down the way they know that organization it's to be done. And one of my favorite interviews was with she was the physical ed person. She would warm the band up physically. Angela, she was a member of the band. She was from Chicago, but she had gone to Baltimore. But now she was a PE teacher in the public school. But she would come do all the physical stuff the first thing in the mornings to make sure they're ready to go, all day. And she talked about how much she valued the band, and she wanted to find some way that she could contribute. She may not have been the best musician, but it was her way of giving back through that. And she really set the tone, and it also saved Mr. Miles from having to get on them all the time, because she would, do that part. But then you would see her interaction with the younger students, with all from the seniors down to the freshmen. And, basically your freshman year, as you were in Florida State, you get there and a lot of times you're going to do what the others are doing right ahead. The director may tell you to go that way, go right, but you're not going to go right until the other 200 go, say that is a huge influence in shaping their experience and how to be in the band. But also the older members have a responsibility to look after and care for their younger members. And then within that context, you have the band sorority. They have TBS, their Tau Beta Sigma, and they also have Kappa Kappa Psi, which, when they go away, they have to, feed them and that sort of thing. And so when they set up the food nicely, and respect them as they come through and care for the band. I guess it's care. And so, they show that care. And then the younger students grow up into those, older. And so it's not that you're the boss, it's that the more responsibility you have, you have to give back as you get older, within the band. And so it's almost like a reverse type thing. More responsibility you have, the more you serve. That's what I saw in that organization. I would say it's pretty much the same across the board. I haven't, been to yet. I'm looking to, engage in other bands and seeing how they function. But I did a lot of reading about FAMU's marching band in the beginning, and Dr. Foster's, his manual, for marching band that everybody still sticks with. And basically that's what he, talks about, that type of care, leadership. And then it also extends down because a lot of the former members that were music education majors, they become band directors in the area. And so they bring their bands back, to be in the parade, and they look up to the Morgan State band members, and it becomes, kind of a pipeline for that in a very positive sense. And even before the homecoming, they did the homecoming parade, had some of these bands, and the younger bands would have a battle, their own battle of the bands, outside of the stadium, and Morgan State community would cheer them on and support them. And, at that age, that could be, very, very inspiring. That could be a game changer there. Valued what you're doing, keep it up, that sort of thing. So I think in that sense, that extends down, to the youth. That extends outside of college age. But then you have this big, intergenerational thread that connects you that you may not have in any other way, but through that band. My dad, he was in the military band, but he was in the other band, but he didn't have that sense of family like, that we know of, but he ended up providing that for us, for my family, my sister, and myself. And even to this day, he's doing those types of things, that he did not have that, but he learned that. And so I see that as another, opportunity, another case per se. The brass band community, we see now that it's really enmeshed in the marching band tradition, even more so. Matt Saccadini wrote a lot about it, but even within TBC, they talk about their college days. The nickname Juicy is actually, his nickname from Southern when he was at Southern. And every time I talk to Bonnie, the tuba player, he's a proud mellophone player, former mellophone player of the marching band. The Soul Rebels, they were all and college marching band people as well. And so I think that also transcends generations, the marching band, into the younger youth. And I think you saw the Roots of Music, that were maybe last year at the MegaCon. They had the Roots of Music, which Derek Tabb, started after Katrina to bridge the gap, once the school system, kind of fumbled there. And so actually when Matt Saccadini brought me down, Matt Saccadini's on that board, and he invited me. They were trying to get into the Rose Bowl parade, and they had this private performance for the chairman, or they travel around, they select. And so I got invited to this private, performance by the Roots of Music for these people. And I got to meet Derek Tabb and all the, the staff there. And they had this snow cone machine snowball machine for the kids for free and that sort of thing. They had from Derek Tabb's, was his nephew maybe it was like 3 or 4 at that point. He's like, but from him, all the way up through the middle school age there in this marching band, multiple ages in that area. And, in that age group, like the difference between a second grader and a third grader is like huge. And like third and fourth, the gap, as far as what they do. But, it's a great opportunity for them to build their own community as they move into the high school. And so there are many different, frames and within the band community that kind of brings this intergenerational experience together, collaboration. I talked about the Jackson Square, like Jackson Square All-Stars. Those of you that know Jackson Square, you go down there and you have, music, they have violinists, they have jugglers, street musicians, that sort of thing. But they also have this brass band that's been playing there for a long time. One time I was down there, I just hung out with them all week down in Jackson Square. And they have this tuba player. His name is Mark Tuba Smith. He's, older. But then the front line mainly was the young guys that would play at night. And so I noticed that, some of the middle-aged older guys, sometimes they wouldn't make it to the gig there. The younger kids would take over their role by doing the crowd interaction, verbatim singing the tunes, and for me, I was like, wow, that's like learning on the porch. Like, they let the older, member take over the show. When they couldn't, they just stepped up and did what they did. And it was just as good or even better in the show. And so that was another, lens for me to see the importance of the intergenerational aspect of the New Orleans Black music culture. And, I think that extends to the marching band. That extends also to popular music realm. You think of people like the Andrews and Trombone Shorty, and then the Neville brothers. They were young when they started, but they had older uncles and stuff that were in it, and they just kind of jumped on board, and they were that sort of thing. So that's a very important aspect to look at. And then also when you look at the military bands, most of those, when they were in the military, they were that age. I mean, they were between 18 and 25. They were still youth, when growing. It was just, within this militaristic setting.
Yeah, and I think that's doing a really good. I like how you're tying together that sense of community and intergenerational dialogue. And it gets me thinking too, that's in terms of kind of your researcher hat, but you also have another hat, which is as educator. So I'm curious about how you feel like, your positionality as an educator. And you're telling me about some of the ensembles that you're leading right now. How do you feel like this idea of intergenerational community building plays into yourself as a facilitator of musical experiences and education, working with youth? How do you feel like you help facilitate in your spaces intergenerational dialogue, I guess, and community building?
Right. For this answer, I'm going to take you back to UConn for a minute. I mentioned the Funky Dogs, but once the Funky Dogs, the brass band I started, we, I brought them down to New Orleans, and we studied with a lot of the best, and they took their time to work with us. The Andrews, we opened for trombone. So we've opened for pretty much all the big time brass bands, when they would come up, Rebirth and Soul Rebels and that sort of thing. But within that, we started an after school program. Well, started off brass band summer camp in Hartford, middle of Hartford, which, it's a challenged area. And so this summer camp, the dogs, I call them the dogs, the Funky Dogs, were with me. And what we did is we put together some pared down brass band music, basically kind of like 3 levels, like when you learn basic, like the Yamaha books have like part A, part B, part C. Like part C is like whole notes, and then part B is a little bit, more meat in it, quarter notes. And then part A, you have the eighth notes. So we had a 2-week camp where we would work with kids. In the first year, we said, we'll take them from, any experience. And then after that, we said, we'll take them if they have at least 1 2 years experience. But the coolest thing about that is that we always played alongside the students, and so the Funky Dogs became like Tommy Weeks was a tenor sax, Mr. Tommy, and Mr. Colin, and they just played beside him. And the funniest thing that came of that is that just drummer Joey Peebles is the drummer for Trombone Shorty, but Joey lives in Hartford, and so he heard of our, camp, and he said, I'll come down, and hang out and check it out. And so we're like, oh, now he may not make it, but he would come down, he'd bring all his extra sticks off tour, and he became known as Mr. Joey, and when you got kids like that, they don't know, they're like, Mr. Joey could be like the neighbor, like you treating him like he's not a rock star, that sort of thing. And I think he loved that. It really started to set the tone and the pattern, for how we work. Fast forward, they still have their own, they don't run that, but they have other after school stuff that they run, as students. So I think, that started we built it into a class. It was an extra thing. And we actually have a class that, did this. And once the university, they wanted me to run a brass band ensemble. And so that ensemble, I would pick students to come down to be teachers. That camp became an after-school program. So we would meet every Wednesday in Hartford, and the dean, funded food, like the chef, the Yukon chef. She met with the chef because we started just giving them the meal of pizza, that sort of thing. And she said, we should really take this seriously as we talk about nutrition. And so we would go down and tutor. We would have a tutoring program, and then we would have a meal, and then we would do a rehearsal. And so, that becomes the college students working with the younger students as well. And then I'm kind of teaching as the faculty supervisor, and all in one space doing the same thing. And that sets the tone. And that idea, it comes from the roots of music and their approach to that. Within their staff, they have these prominent brass band musicians. They probably know Mr. Derek Tabb, but don't know that he's world renowned. And, they would have, other members, Soul Rebel members that would come, be a part of that. And, I think that culture was, from the porch, from the old neighborhoods. And so fast forward to Oxford College, I don't have a brass band class per se because, I don't have the critical mass of brass players, but I did start a popular African-American music ensemble in which I actually play in myself. And so, I'm doing it alongside them. And here at Oxford College, we have students from everywhere, and we have a lot of international students. What blew me away is that they come in and they know some of this rep. He's a guitar player, but he's playing bass for us. He's from Beijing, China, and knows this stuff. I have somebody from Winnipeg, Canada. Of course, you're Alabama's represented. We have other areas. But, with me being in there playing, not instructing, part of that, it's a different type of class. We're growing together, and I can see the same type of spirit and growth and camaraderie that was built within the Funky Dogs. I played within the Funky Dogs as well. I performed and played with them. I wasn't, put them out there and watch. I was part of the group. All the recordings that we have, it's a really unique way, of, bringing these intergenerational opportunities together. As we move forward, I'm looking to invite musicians from the area to come on board as coaches, basically play alongside as needed, because I think there's something that's deeper that goes on when you're playing, along some side. And also they get better quicker. We found that with the after school program. If you hear that tone, the trumpet's supposed to sound like this, a clarinet like this, and you're like sitting next to it every week, you tend to kind of go, in the right direction with that. So So that's the type of thing that I'm trying to build with this new ensemble. Of course, my role model for this, or the model, is Dr. Portia Maltby, who started, probably the first African American popular music ensemble at IU in the late '60s. And reason why she was tapped to do that is that she had her own band. She was singing and doing this, performing that context, that genre, and she was asked to start that. And she would be on the stage, with doing her thing. Even now, they have the person who runs it, plays bass with the group. Within the African American music tradition, you see a lot of that. You see when you go to the Black churches, you'll see a lot of the youth singing along with the older choir. I just played a church anniversary of one of the oldest African American congregational churches in Atlanta. They had their anniversary yesterday, and you had this, mixture of youth singing "Reason Why We Sing," Kirk Franklin. And that reminds us that it's important that they see us, doing the thing together, and so I think trying to bring that way of doing it within this more formalized context, but also, having the opportunity to theorize and, bring scholarship into why this way of learning and doing is important, or even more so important than some of the other things that we do, within our class. And I think also in this age of course, it's all over the map, but equity, diversity on campus, and I think a lot of time, it's very important. I think a lot of times you search and for this program, that program, but sometimes you just hang with these people that do this stuff. I got officer, public safety officer who went to Berkeley as a drummer, and they see him, as one of the Black officers on campus, but hey, he's behind the kit. Or we have, elsewhere in the community, and it's not just, African American. It's others. My colleagues, I'm in the humanities. Once they got wind of what I'm doing, they're like, I play bass, I play guitar, and that sort of thing. And I said, look, I leave the stuff open. Come in. Your students would love to be a part of that. Hopefully we can have them join us on a more, full scale basis. And I think that would be important in building just our community as Oxford College, something unique, to us in itself, because, we're outside of Atlanta. Atlanta has a lot. The kids have access to go into Atlanta, but, we're out here and not as much to do, but this, can add to their experience. So, and I'll make one more connection, which, the band community would understand, the community band. And when I was in high school, our community they were launching the community band, when I was in high school. And I was on board for that. I think I was a sophomore, junior, but I would go and play, alongside the professors that were at Virginia Tech, at that age, and you're just playing the marches with them or whatever we're playing. And then you have those that had retired long time ago, and they're just getting it back. And so I was, part of that as well. And that really taught me a lot in the importance, of intergenerational musicking,
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that's part of the reason as well. You were talking about this earlier about how a lot of these Southern band traditions, like military, higher ed, brass, not just Southern, but it seems like these spaces keep the repertoire circulating. Like,
yes,
you were talking about how a lot of the students that you work with, granted in the pop music context, know this repertoire. You're talking about how, like, up in Connecticut, y'all were engaging with like New Orleans brass repertoire. And I don't know about you, like, I run into Southern alum all over the Gulf Coast, like they graduated from that marching band context. So I think it's really cool to see these kind of Southern derived genres making their way to different contexts. It's a really cool kind of like trans-regional thing, it seems like.
Yes, and of course, the internet and everything helps that. But even like Southern, they do that "do what you wanna." I mean and it's huge, and that's from New Orleans, and that's their school. But I wanted to say, you were talking about the Funky Dogs learning the repertoire, and that was one of the things. Glenn David Andrews is the cousin of trombone shorty Troy Andrews, and cousin of James Andrews. And he thanked us for learning, keeping their tradition alive. We have on the website, there's, I think it's like 2015, and it has him at the end saying like he endorses us 110%. But he respected that we respected their culture so much that we were down. And he's like, "Oh, I'm gonna pick you up, and you be on this corner at this certain time, and I'm gonna bring the van down. I'll pick you up, and we're gonna have some sessions." Of course, we couldn't all fit in his van, so some of us had to Uber out. He was on the east side at that point, and so we went to his house, and we talked a little bit, and then we got to playing, and he's just kind of moving us around and talking about who to listen to and that sort of thing. And then he all of a sudden, in the middle of our session, we're in his neighborhood, in his house, in the back room of his house. And he's like, "All right, everybody up, 2x2, 2x2. And so we like, and if those who know Glenn David, he's flamboyant. And so we're like, all right, so we get 2x2. And so we go out his back door in the backyard and the fence. And so we start to second line. So we get out to the main road, well, his neighborhood road, and he forms us in a second line parade formation. The brass in the front line and then the back line, percussion, the tuba. And we're taking up the whole road, Emily. He's Glenn David. He can do that. Cars will wait. I don't know. We were out there and he would stop us. He's like, "Can't let this part of the line move forward. I can't hear you." That sort of thing. He stopped. And then he got going, and things were sounding great, and he's doing his martial stuff, dancing. And then all of a sudden he leads us to this house. And we're standing at this house, and he lines us up. He's like, "All right, get ready to play this tune." And we're sitting there, and he goes and rings the doorbell. This little lady comes to the door, and then we start playing. And so we're playing, and she's dancing and stuff. It turned out at the time it was his mother-in-law. It was like being on the porch, and he marched us back and that sort of thing. And so he really loved that we respected the culture. And I think the reason why most of those bands that were from New Orleans, like Rebirth, Soul Rebels, Hot 8, we met Hot 8, but I don't think we opened for them. But the reason why Troy Shorty, and Preservation Hall, is because we learned the traditional, side of the coin, as well as, the more contemporary side, and respect the culture and that sort of thing. And this is, with my African American popular music ensemble, it's the same thing. We're doing, Martha and the Vandellas, Bill Withers, Stevie Wonder, Kool in the Gang. It gives us an opportunity to talk about the importance of their music and the culture. We'll expand that. This is our first semester doing it, but, I have a long, long list of tunes I'd like to, put in our repertoire. And I look to have it grow much like the Funky Dogs. The Funky Dogs brass band are still together, even though I'm down here, but they're their own LLC. They're out there playing, gigging. Of course, anytime there's a New Orleans happening up in that area, Connecticut, that's the first call. I mean, people in Southern Connecticut are rich. And so we would get called to play this at his house. They're just having their party in West End somewhere. And these people had flown fresh crawfish from New Orleans. Like, they drove out on the tarmac to get the, right then. And they brought in, the things are crawling out, And I'm like, wow. And so we would always bring the party, but we learned from the best, sitting down there Thursday nights, at the Les Bon Temps Roulette with the Soul Rebels, or going on Tuesday nights at the Maple Leaf, the Rebirth. Now TBC's out there. And so we learned how to do that through the Stooges. We've opened for the Stooges a few times. So, that's the most credible field work I could ever have, and, to be that in the backstage between shows, picking the brains, the Preservation Hall, the Stooges, Rebirth, Soul Rebels. Such a remarkable experience.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love how rich and multi-sided, and how, like you said, fieldwork changes you. And
Yeah.
It sounds like there's been a lot of like great collaboration along the way and whatnot. Well, thank you, Marvin, so much for chatting with us. I really enjoyed learning about your work. And listeners, just to give you a quick recap as we wrap up, this was an interview with Marvin McNeil, Assistant Professor of Music and African American Studies at the Oxford College of Emory University. And I will catch you next time here on Take on the South.
That was our Take on the South. Let us know yours. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at U of SC South. Take on the South is produced by Matt Simmons of the Institute for Southern Studies. Special thanks to Professor Dave Garner of the University of South Carolina School of Music for composing our music. Tune in next time for another Take on the South.